Thank you for tuning into the WOLA podcast. I'm Adam Isacson, and I'm here to remind you that these podcasts are free and ad-free, but the Washington Office on Latin America is an independent organization. We operate entirely on gifts and donations, so please support our work. The easiest way to do that is by visiting wola.org and clicking donate. It's right there at the top. And this is a very crucial moment for us to be getting any support that you're able to provide because it is quite a year already. We have seen unilateral military action occur in Venezuela. The Trump administration sent the Delta Force into Caracas, bombing targets in and around Caracas while removing President Nicolás Maduro and his wife from the country. They have now been presented in a court in New York City. But as of now, it is not a democratic transition, and there's really no mentions of the word democracy from the current occupants of the White House when they talk about what their plans are. Lots of mentions of oil, not much about democracy, human rights, anti-corruption, or accountability. And even beyond that, the mission and the goal of the Trump administration are really not clear. It seems to almost depend on who you ask. And as with the lethal boat strikes since September of last year, international law and congressional war powers just appear to be completely out the window. You would be right to be filled with dread about what might happen next. But, whatever the plan is, the rights and well-being of the Venezuelan people absolutely don't seem to be at the center of it, even though they absolutely should be. This episode, recorded on January 6th, is with two of my colleagues at WOLA who know Venezuela intimately well and who are doing a remarkable job of reacting to and informing about what's going on. They are Carolina Jiménez Sandoval, WOLA's president, and Laura Deeb, the director of WOLA's Venezuela program. Both have been on the podcast several times before. I'm grateful that they were able to carve out some time now during this intense period of crisis. Let's listen. Carolina Jiménez, president of WOLA, thank you for joining the podcast. Hello.
Thank you for having me, Adam.
Of course. And Laura Deeb, the director of WOLA's Venezuela program. Laura, hello.
Hi, Adam. Thank you for the invitation.
No, well, thank you both for making time. I know this has been probably one of the busiest weeks of your lives, and we don't even know when this might even stop being busy. Something very historic has happened. I mean, in post-World War II United States history, there have been direct U.S. military interventions in the Dominican Republic in 1965, and Panama in 1989, Haiti in 1994, Grenada 83. This, especially since we don't know how it's going to end, could dwarf all of those. It could be bigger. So it's a huge concern. But, you both are citizens of Venezuela. I'm sure you have a lot to tell about current concerns, what's happening, and what is most foremost that our listeners should know about what's been happening since January 3rd. Carolina.
Thank you, Aaron. Well, needless to say, and I have to confess that the bombing of Caracas, Venezuela's capital, and of other cities in Venezuela caught most of us by surprise. It was a major shock when we started receiving all the reports from colleagues and friends and families on the ground. And once we started looking at the news and the images and realized this was indeed a military attack from the US, everything started from there. Our analysis, our work about what it was all about. It wasn't something that happened in isolation. Since at least August 2025, we were looking at a major military buildup in the Caribbean, close to Venezuela's northern coast. From September to the end of December 2025, military attacks in the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific caused the death of at least 115 people in what is considered extrajudicial executions, the designation of the so-called Cartel de los Soles and the Trinidad terrorist organizations, and the name of Nicolás Maduro as the head of these criminal organizations, etc. So there was a scenario for a military attack, but we never thought it was going to be this form of military attack. Most analysts were expecting perhaps some isolated or random specific targets. People were thinking that perhaps a cocaine lab or some attacks against military targets in rural Venezuela. I think the bombing of Caracas and of other important locations in Venezuela was a very unexpected thing for us to witness. And as we have said, since this happened, it constitutes a major breach of international law.
Yeah, absolutely. Laura?
I think that Carolina mentioned this is indeed a breach of international law. It is very important to understand how things are seen under a different light from the Venezuela perspective. Venezuelans have been living under an authoritarian government for years. Venezuelans have committed themselves to a democratic route on 2024, according to international observation missions, independent and credited observation missions. They had won, the opposition had won those elections, and Maduro refused to give power. Under those conditions, Venezuelans now see what's happening. Despite the unlawfulness of this situation, they see it with cautious optimism. The reason why I say this is because there are reasons for Venezuelans to feel the way they do about seeing Nicolás Maduro detained. But let's remember that he's not being investigated for human rights violations. He's being investigated on an account of drug trafficking and connections with illicit economies. And it is so hard for Venezuelans as they are in a situation of fear. So far, there has not been a transition. The person in power continues to be a part of that authoritarian government, and there has not been a democratic opening. So right now, the situation in the ground is a situation of fear, and everyone's kind of waiting and seeing how things will unfold. And let's remember that the Trump administration, on their first remarks, they said that we shouldn't discard a second bombing. So that is something that people are also considering that could happen.
Yeah, I mean, there must be a lot of fear on the streets right now. The Berlin Wall did not come falling down in Venezuela this weekend. In fact, it looks like the only change in where power lies and who's running Venezuela right now is that Nicolás Maduro and his wife are no longer in the picture. Is the Trump administration's intention to leave in place what appears to be the rest of Chavismo? It's very hard to interpret what the Trump administration has been saying in a lot of his declarations the last few days. But maybe I should phrase the question like this. Who is governing in Venezuela right now?
So Delcy Rodriguez was the vice president. And Delcy Rodriguez, after the attack, the Supreme Court in Venezuela issued what first was a press statement, and then it became a ruling. They decided that they were doing what in Spanish would be the oficio, like they were doing it without a request, setting the tone for what under our constitution is considered a temporary absence rather than a permanent absence. The reason why legally this is important is because they're not calling for an election. They are basically using the same thesis of continuity that they used when Chavez died and Nicolás Maduro stayed in power without calling immediately for an election. So Delcy Rodriguez is the one in power right now. She was sworn in before the National Assembly in front of Nicolás Maduro's son, who is also in the indictment before the New York court. And she, Delcy Rodriguez appeared on national television surrounded by people like Diosdado, who's the Minister of Interior and the head of the repressive apparatus, and also next to Vladimir Padrino, who is the Minister of Defense, and he also has a reward on his head, right? The bounty that was increased during the Biden administration and now under Trump. So who's running the country? The same government. That's the short answer. And therefore, there's no guarantee right now for political prisoners that remain arbitrarily detained, and there doesn't seem to be a democratic opening. Moreover, what is concerning is that in the Trump administration's statements, there has been a continuous disregard of the opposition, despite the fact that the opposition, regardless of their political beliefs, won that election from 2024. This should be a Venezuelan-led transition and not an imposition from an external country.
Let me just ask Carolina about the opposition. I was, I don't follow Venezuela anywhere near as closely. I was shocked. My jaw hit the floor when Donald Trump said some very dismissive things about opposition leader Maria Corina Machado, who had just won the Nobel Peace Prize, and then indicated a willingness to work with Delcy Rodriguez and the Chavistas. Did you find this surprising? And what's the next step for the opposition?
Well, the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, has been trying to explain what Trump means, which is not something new. It seems that different secretaries in the Trump administration have to interpret Trump's words for the rest of the world, and this wasn't an exception, because everyone was very shocked to hear that Trump was dismissive of Maria Corina Machado and the Democratic opposition in general. And of course, I think the world was also very shocked when he said that he was going to run Venezuela. And no one really knows what that means. It is true that as we learn about what happened, because this is a puzzle, we're still putting all the pieces together. There is a lot of information that we don't know, a lot of back channel negotiations that we don't know about. So we're trying to put all the pieces together. It seems that before the decision was made to carry out a military attack, the Trump administration studied, the de facto power of the opposition, how likely it was that they could control the armed forces or work in coalition with the armed forces. The armed forces have always been a key factor for Maduro's political survival. It is true that it would be difficult to think of the current high officials within the armed forces working hand in hand with Machado. So it seems that there was a very pragmatic decision made by the administration in terms of wanting to negotiate with those they considered the ones that could have a working relationship with the armed forces, but with all the actors that are in charge of security forces in Venezuela, because we all know that there are different armed groups operating in the country. That said, and as much as, it can make sense from a very realistic and pragmatic political point of view, that cannot be the status quo. I mean, yes, it seems that for the administration, Delcy Rodriguez and her brother, because it's important that our listeners understand that they come in tandem. These are the Rodriguez siblings. Now we have the executive branch under Delcy Rodriguez and the legislative branch under Jorge Rodriguez. The judicial branch in Venezuela it really basically does not exist. It's absolutely under the control of the executive branch. So we do have the Rodriguez siblings in charge of the country. There needs to be a solid plan for a peaceful transition in which the political democratic opposition takes a central role. Laura already described who Delcy Rodriguez was. When you think about other actors, political actors within Chavismo, most of them are people who are being investigated for corruption scandals in other countries or for human rights violations. So there needs to be a transition that includes democratic voices, and we hope the administration in Washington can use its leverage to shape that movement forward.
Go ahead, Laura.
Yes, if I can add something, I think that in every transition, it is understandable that not everything can be imploded and that you need control over certain structures. So that pragmatic approach is understandable to a certain extent, because what we face right now is the possibility of a change without a transition. And that would mean, or what I have been calling a transition without a transition, which would be a perpetuation in time of the status quo, as Carolina mentioned. And that would not solve the complex humanitarian emergency and would continue or would preserve under an authoritarian rule. When mentioning who Delcy Rodriguez is very important to also keep in mind that between 2018 and 2021, as vice president, legally, the vice president was overseeing the SEBIN, which is the Bolivarian intelligence. In that role, she's mentioned in the 20th report from the fact-finding mission. She's also perceived as an actor that can be an interlocutor with the private sector because she occupied the position of oil minister. But that doesn't mean that she has necessarily democracy and protection of human rights at the core, and it doesn't mean that she is a moderate. If anything, she has been a part of the government since the Chavez administration, and she has occupied positions in which she clearly knew directly from human rights violations and continues to do so. So it is crucial that if the U.S. is leading, as they have said, this process, that they hear Venezuelan voices and that they make sure that there's actually a transformation rather than a perpetuation of status quo. Now, I'm not saying by this that what happened was legal. It never should have happened. But now that the U.S. broke the plate, cannot leave Venezuelans standing on their own in this terrible situation in which things can actually be worse than they were before the U.S. did this attack.
Okay, I've got a complicated multi-part question here, so take notes. None of our past training ever prepared us for trying to interpret what people in the Trump administration are saying. It's a special skill that almost nobody has. But if we can try to interpret it, it seems like Donald Trump has been communicating that if you let the United States and their oil companies have access to the oil, if they take as many deported Venezuelans as possible, if they at least put on a show of fighting narco trafficking, maybe some extraditions or something, if they limit the influence of Iran on China, then they will let them govern and they can pretty much do anything else they want within those guidelines. So first question is what I just said, does that sound right? Second, in the press conference on Saturday, they didn't even mention the word democracy. When Marco Rubio on the Sunday morning news shows was asked about an electoral transition, I think he said something like, we all like elections, but the United States has more immediate interest, and then started referring to those four things that I just mentioned. Is there a transition plan? It seems like, we're going to have, like you said, Laura, these are the people who can govern right now, but ... eventually the opposition, the 2024 election result might be respected. And that's something we're hearing from some South Florida members of Congress right now, but I don't know what's in the ... in between. And then third, Delcy Rodriguez was at least nominally the head of Sabine, one of the intelligence services, which for those who've heard of the Helicoide, the torture prison in Caracas, that's Sabine. But there are other power centers. If you define power only as like the capacity to carry out violence, does Delcy actually have control? Or do those other power centers obey her and her brother? Or is power very fragmented in Caracas right now? So I know that was a lot of questions, but I thought I'd blurt them all out at once. And why don't I go to Carolina first to hear what you think about that?
Those are, all of those questions require a different podcast. So you have a lot of podcasts to do in the coming days.
I've got a lot of time.
On the question about what the Trump administration is demanding from the de facto authorities in Venezuela, your points are very interesting because to the best of our knowledge, Maduro offered all of those things to Trump. He offered Trump, great, apparently excellent oil deals, and Trump refused them. He offered Trump access to minerals, etc. We know that there are weekly deportation flights to Caracas, even at the worst moment in their bilateral relationship, those flights were taking place. The only thing, perhaps, that we did not see Maduro doing was severing relationships with the U.S. enemies. Maduro was still close to Russia, to Iran, to China, and other countries, and that that probably was a reason for example, for Secretary Rubio to push for his downfall. It's an open question how Delcy Rodriguez will react to those relations, because those countries have been key allies of Chavismo since Chavez was alive. It's an open question, but if, as Trump said very clearly during the press conference, if Delcy Rodriguez is going to do whatever the administration wants her to do, she will need to start taking some distance from these allies, because they are considered, I insist, enemies of the United States. And especially Marco Rubio had always been very vocal about relationships with Iran and others. So to be seen. And on your questions on the fragmentation of power in Venezuela, I think it's very difficult not to think about the time when Hugo Chavez was in power and once, he passed away. Chavez was sort of the glue of Chavismo. Chavismo, like any other major populist movement, was never a unified, homogeneous movement. But Chavez was the glue of the movement. And having been a military man, a strong, caudillo, charismatic leader, the power he exercised over different factions was basically unchallenged. Once Chavez passed away and Maduro came to power, the first thing that we all immediately knew is that, unlike Chavez, Maduro was a civilian. And he needed the support of the armed forces. And he gained this support by giving the military even more power than Chavez had already given them. But not just political power, but also economic power. Both formally, we know that things like the oil company is run by the military, but also informally. We also know that many members of the military, especially high officials, are connected to illicit economies. So Maduro sort of administered power, and he gave different factions different forms of power, and that includes repression. So in the same way that armed forces exercise repression, you also have security forces like the police, the National Guard. National Guard is part of the military, but it's a different branch from the army or the navy. Yeah, you have the intelligence, you have the counter-military agency, then you have the colectivos, which are paramilitary groups, etc. All of these groups are led by different people.
Oh, different people.
And Maduro let them all operate, and they all have different levels of power. So I do think that, again, an open question to see how Rodriguez manages that, the fragmentation of power and also the administration of repression.
Go ahead, Laura.
Yeah, I think to add to some of the points that Carolina already made, you are right that according to some filtrations to the press, we know that the administration asked for de facto government to stop selling oil to the U.S. adversaries, to continue receiving those deportation flights, and to combat narco trafficking or stop the flow of drugs to the U.S. So those apparently would be some of their requests. As Carolina mentioned, no mention to democracy, release of political prisoners, or anything of that sort. In terms of oil, I would like to stress that on the one hand, Venezuela sells around 80% by some accounts, because there's no official information, it might be even more than that, to Asia, and in particular to China. So I also don't foresee a scenario in which it would be easy for the Maduro government to do that, to stop selling that much, unless the U.S. decides to buy that oil. Remember that we are a country that has sanctions, and the only oil that is flowing to the U.S. is under the Chevron license. And I think it's also very important to keep in mind that there's a big difference between having the biggest oil reserves in the world and actually having the capacity to produce oil that can be exported. And the capacity from the Venezuelan infrastructure to produce oil right now is less than 2% of the global supply. So it's not enough just to have this sort of de facto authoritarian government in order to actually have the investment that the infrastructure requires and the guarantees under rule of law to actually improve the economic situation of Venezuela. So that's also an important point. In terms of elections, the one thing that I would give the benefit of the doubt to the administration here is that Venezuela already held presidential elections in 2024. And in a context of a transition, and transitions are what are possible in practical terms and not necessarily what we would like for those transitions to be. And in a context that is so fragile, you are likely going to have a negotiation process initially that will stabilize the country, and you need to renew the institutions, and in particular the National Electoral Council, that lacks entirely the conditions and the independence that it would require to hold elections. So that's like the one point that I would make based on a human rights approach. And just on the fragmentation, yes, I agree with Carolina that power is fragmented, but in the current context, I do wonder, and hearing from some of our partners on the ground and how things are being perceived in a context where Maduro is in prison and they're trying to survive and potentially avoid a second strike from the U.S., they seem to be, at least on the Rodriguez and the Cabellos, they seem to be acting, at least for now, in cohesion. And they have been really smart at reorganizing themselves, and despite the internal divisions, holding on to power. We could see a scenario in which they actually mock the U.S. administration and end up being even stronger than they were before.
Wow. The possibility of a second strike is something that we should talk about maybe in another podcast, because it hasn't happened yet. And that's so much crystal ball gazing, more than we should do, but it is something that we have to worry about. And of course, if the United States does actually ever introduce boots on the ground, we will immediately have to start introducing people to phenomena like the armed forces, the colectivos, the intelligence services, and anyone else who would be a potential resistance to more of a U.S. commitment, which is certainly something likely. But let's leave that for now, because I would like to talk more about the human rights situation right now. I mean, you can tell me, about 1,000 political prisoners inside Venezuela. Civil society and the free press were barely able to function. What's the situation now?
Yes. So it's important to keep in mind that repression in Venezuela has been sustained since the post-electoral context in 2024. Originally, back then, there were over 2,000 people that were detained. Then there has been some releases, but this operates as a revolving door where some people are released and then others are detained again. So what's the human rights situation right now? We know that nearly 1,000 people remain detained. There hasn't been any official account because the government does not recognize these people as disappeared, but from our own partners, nearly 200 people that the government continues to deny their whereabouts. So they are missing. They're forcibly disappeared. The situation right now, and this is also very interesting from a legal perspective, on January 3rd, after the attack, it started to circulate a version of the official gazette with a decree of external commotion, which means it would be an exceptional state or a state of exception in English. And that decree has the signature, allegedly, of Nicolás Maduro, although he had already been taken by then by the U.S. military. There have been talk about this decree of external commotion since the boat strikes in the Caribbean, but it was never published. And according to Venezuelan law, it is not enough to publish it in the official gazette. It needs to go through the judiciary. But in this suspension or this decree, in Article 5, basically is an authorization to detain anyone that allegedly supported U.S. actions. And that's the way that it's being interpreted by people on the ground. Just today, 2 people were detained in Mérida, and they were elder people, agricultors that were detained because they were celebrating Nicolás Maduro's detention. We are likely going to see, and we had warned about this in December, that if there was an action from the U.S. that did not involve the Venezuelan democratic forces, that didn't have democracy at heart, it could actually embolden the Maduro authorities and increase repression. And that's a big risk that we're facing right now.
So, okay, the number of political prisoners is in danger of increasing pretty quickly as a result of this emergency decree. Carolina, are you hearing similar or more?
Yes, yesterday we heard very alarming reports about the detention of journalists and press workers. The National Assembly was inaugurating its session for 2026, and whenever there is a new session of Congress, journalists show up. It's a very normal thing to do. But in this context, informing, like it's been the case in Venezuela for many years, let's say the restrictions are different at the moment. There were at least 14 journalists and press workers detained. They were released after a few hours, but I guess it's a sign of the times we live in. There is one thing about human rights, Adam, that I would like our listeners to hear, because it's often difficult to understand the magnitude of a human rights crisis in any country. I always say that every country in the planet has human rights challenges. Of course, the level of institutional development and of democratic governance has an impact on how good or bad the human rights situation is. But if there is an important indicator to take into consideration in the Venezuelan case, is the fact that Venezuela is the only country in the Americas with an open investigation before the International Criminal. What does that mean? People will say, well, I'm not a lawyer, I don't know what that means. First of all, crimes against humanity, right? What do we mean by that? And when you say a crime against humanity has been committed, we're saying that those crimes are so grave that they don't only impact a society or an individual, they impact humanity as a whole. Why? Because they are generalized and systematic. Venezuelan case is now being investigated for at least 4 crimes that are under these Rome statutes. sexual violence, torture, arbitrary deprivation of liberty, and political persecution. It's hard to get data from a country where opacity is usually the rule. There is no access to information. But just to think about security operations, in Venezuela, there are a lot of elite groups that go into the poor neighborhoods with the excuse or pretext to fight crime and just kill people and kill thousands of young men, usually poor young men, because they go to the poorest neighborhoods of Caracas. So in the same way, that we are...
Elite groups, you mean elite groups tied to the state? Just to clarify, elite groups tied to the state?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
The so-called FAES group, which is a group from the National Police, just changed its name, but it's exactly the same group. When Michelle Bachelet was the High Commissioner for Human Rights at the United Nations, she called on the Venezuelan government to dismantle the FAES because didn't at that time. By some accounts, it is possible that 15,000 extrajudicial executions have been committed. Just think of that number. We often think of Argentina and the number of 30,000 people who disappeared, right? Well, Venezuela have less people than Argentina, right? I mean, only around 25 million people live in the country. And we're likely to count 15,000 extrajudicial executions. So I think it's important that people understand the magnitude of the human rights crisis. Now, as I have said many times, does that justify military attacks? No, absolutely no. But I think it's very important people understand the dimension of the human rights crisis Venezuela have been facing for decades now.
And meanwhile, the intervention that just happened and that is still being threatened, for now at least, is leaving those structures in place. And there's no talk about accountability or justice, transitional or otherwise, or even truth yet, because these de facto powers remain in place. And let me pivot from that to the Trump administration's strategy toward the whole region, because it is a strategy that it lays out a right to intervene in this or similar fashion elsewhere, but without even the trappings of democracy, human rights, or accountability, or anti-corruption, or really just defining U.S. interests really in a more narrow way. I was listening to the New York Times podcast where Jonathan Blitzer was pointing out that a lot of what just happened is a message to the rest of the region also, whoever might defy the United States. So what does this, as well as the lethal boat strikes that have been happening since September, tell us about what the Trump administration's plans are for the entire region? Because this has obviously been a warning shot that has been deafening throughout the entire hemisphere. Carolina, I'll ask you that. Any reflections on the regional implications of this?
Where do we start? I mean, what type of precedent has been set, right?
Yes.
I think until January 3rd, 2026, we felt that there was a gap between what Trump said in terms of his threats towards countries in the region and what he actually did. And we felt that a lot of his boisterous comments and constant threats were empty words, and the whole thing was a bluff. Not anymore.
Right.
I think the message is very clear. The U.S. is willing to use all resources, including military resources, to carry out its threats. And again, it sets a terrible precedent for the region. International law is precisely to limit the naked power of the states. The world had a major trauma in the first half of the 20th century. Millions and millions of people died because the power of the states couldn't be contained, and that led to no one but two major world wars. We created the whole architecture of international institutions and law to avoid that from happening again. That architecture was precisely created by the superpowers. So to have one of those superpowers now being led by an administration under President Trump disregard those basic rules of engagement is very alarming. When you look at the national security strategy, you see that the administration has put the Western Hemisphere as its theater of operations and main priority. Is certainly a cause for concern. We know that the U.S. will be holding midterm elections this year. There's still a lot of things can happen from now to November. But I think it's become very clear that there needs to be more check and balances around the executive power in the United States.
Right. And this is all happening. You mentioned the architecture that's been in place since World War II. The United States has intervened militarily in other countries in Latin America since World War II. But in what you could argue has been always couched in the language of anti-communism, and they like to throw out the words democracy and freedom and try to limit the scope of it, but not just because a country defied them or didn't see things their way or stood in the way of investments. And Trump right now is nakedly saying that. And I know that WOLA has partners, in particularly in Mexico and Colombia right now, who are quite alarmed at some of the threats that have come out of the president's mouth in the past few days aimed at their countries as well, because now we know how far they're willing to go. But as you mentioned, they're also willing to do it without obeying or even formally recognizing the congressional power to declare war here in the United States. Let me pivot a bit. Can we talk a bit about a quarter of Venezuela's population, more or less? About 8 million people have migrated elsewhere in the region, but also, since 2021, about 800,000 Venezuelan citizens came to the U.S.-Mexico border. Most of them are still inside the United States, even as the Trump administration has revoked many protections for them. What are your reflections on what this means for the migrant population?
Well, what we've seen during the Trump administration has been a complete disregard for the rights of migrants and refugees, the termination of the humanitarian parole, termination of the TPS, the application of the Alien Enemy Act to deport people to Ecuador, and more recently, the Venezuelans' inclusion in the travel ban in the first version and then in the second one, which has also led to an analysis of cases of asylum that had been granted during the Biden administration and a freeze in the analysis of asylum cases from Venezuelans now and even of green cards. So again, a very hostile situation for migrants and refugees. In this particular context, I worry that even though President Trump, during his address on January 3rd, said that he was going to take care of Venezuelans here, which was a change in speech that caught my attention, I worry that now the narrative could shift to say that Venezuela without Maduro is now a safe country, therefore all Venezuelans should be returned or something of that sort. I would like to stress that since February up until November, deportation flights continue to happen and over 17,000 people have been returned to Venezuela. The people that are returned to Venezuela are directly received by members of the government. It has been impossible for civil society to document what is the future of those people that are, what happens after.
Yeah, that's alarming. And I would note that in the past couple of days, Homeland Security Secretary Kirsty Noem said that Venezuelans can now return to Venezuela and apply for refugee status there. There's no U.S. embassy. And right now, refugee status is only really being granted to a small handful of white South Africans. So that was quite a cynical thing to say in my personal view. Finally, I would like to hear from both of you just about all of the other actors who may or may not have a role here. The U.S. Congress, other governments, both in Latin America and in Europe, international organizations, particularly the OAS, the UN, the Inter-American Human Rights Commission, the media, and of course, civil society. That's a lot of actors, and I've probably forgotten some. But externally, what's your evaluation of how some of these actors have been responding and what they might be able to do? I'll go to you first, Laura.
I would like to answer this question starting by saying that we're globally in a context of deep polarization and decline of democracy. But human rights standards provide us with some lenses and a set of standards that are universal. And that should be the main message for all of the actors that you mentioned before, which means that condemning the U.S. complete disregard for international law and for the agency of the region and its autonomy should go hand in hand with also denouncing the human rights violations that occur in Venezuela. I think that should be the message for all of the actors to stand in solidarity with the people that are suffering the most in Venezuela, while also understanding why people in the region and in particular in countries like Colombia are very worried, in Mexico as well, about the impact of the U.S. administration's approach. So my main call, especially for U.S. authorities and for Congress, should be that for Democrat offices and for Republicans that have been critical of the Trump administration's approach is to go beyond the condemnation and also think about what could be done to stand in solidarity with Venezuelans. And that means reclaiming their agency, providing support to democratic forces. We have the reconciliation bill coming up, and there's in the House version of the appropriations bill, there's funding for democracy programs. That funding should be reinstated.
Restoring what was cut,
Exactly, the money that was cut. We have also advocated for a Venezuela restoration fund, so money that comes from corruption can actually be used for the restoration of Venezuela, thinking about ways in which Venezuela can actually now, in the midst of this crisis, actually transit into another stage that opens an opportunity for democracy. There's a lot to be done, and it's important that actors go beyond just condemning the administration, rightfully so.
Yeah, so Carolina, I mean, all those actors, but what we have traditionally called the international community has been under assault lately. This seems to be an opportunity to rise to the occasion, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on where they can all go from here.
Absolutely. This is the time to rise to the occasion. And taking into consideration what Laura just said, I guess this needs to go both ways. On the one hand, we do need a U.S. Congress and an international community that stand up against this outrageous breach of international law by the U.S. Because today is a military attack against Venezuela. What will it be tomorrow? Once it happens, and it happens with self-congratulatory messages like what we saw during the press conferences and all the interviews of different spokespeople from the administration, we know this can happen again. So it's very important that we have check and balances on the U.S. executive power around this idea that they can solve or lead their international relations through a military approach. At the same time, as Laura said, any potential route towards building a democratic Venezuela will require investment. It is a country with great needs, both at the political and civil side of the story, but also on the humanitarian side. Venezuela needs the support of the international community, and it certainly needs the support of the United States. So it would be very important that during the discussions on, for appropriations, this is taken into consideration. And, other important and key actors, both regional countries in the region, Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, countries that can speak to the current de facto authorities, but also other countries that are broadly closer to the opposition. I think instead of just having permanent disagreements on Venezuela, it would be great if we have a more multilateral and coordinated effort to define a course of action towards democratic transition. It's very hard for Venezuela to do this on its own. Yes, any transition should be led by Venezuelans, but support from the international community is key and absolutely necessary. Venezuelans expressed themselves powerfully on July 28, 2024, and I think they chose democracy, and that's what most people are expecting and desiring.
And it is crucial to stand with them. Just to cite a headline of a foreign affairs piece from Juan Gonzalez, the former Biden administration official, that headline was, "This is the end of the beginning in Venezuela." That just means the story has just begun. We're going to be deeply engaged with this in the coming months, both in an advocacy standpoint, but also communications and information standpoint, providing credible information to you, our listeners, our supporters, all audiences that are open to listening, to hear not just us getting the facts out, but also trying to convey from the Venezuelan people themselves what the alternatives are and how we can keep moving. We'll be using the podcasts, our publications, and really all other media that work for us in order to get that out. So keep following us, keep supporting us. And Laura, Carolina, thank you for your time. This is, I know, one of the busiest times in your professional career so far, so I appreciate you carving out this moment to talk. Thank you for joining the podcast.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you, Adam.
Many thanks to you for listening, and thanks to Carolina and Laura for giving me and all of you their perspective on what is happening in their home country in Venezuela. I think we'll be talking to them very soon because this is just starting, I'm afraid. It may spread elsewhere. I really hope that you will stay tuned and keep listening to our podcast. We will continue to make them as well as many other products. As I mentioned at the beginning, everything that WOLA does and produces, especially now, we depend on donations. We are independent and we will remain so, but we do rely on the support of thousands of individuals like you to make these episodes and everything else that we do happen. If you are already a supporter, thank you for making this work possible. Thank you for listening to us. If you're not a supporter, just remember that you could be very easily. But either way, we thank you for listening, for watching. If you're on video, stay well, and goodbye for now.